Welcome to the International Schools Podcast. I'm your co host, John Mickton. Dan is still traveling. We, in our schools and in any schools, be it international or local schools, schools are like a life cycle. You know, kids come in their early years, maybe 3 years old, and some kids might stay in the same school system till they're 18. In international schools, we have kids that are moving and going. We have some kids that stay longer, but there's always a life cycle. And as kids are in schools and us as educators and leaders, life goes on. Things happen to us and we bring them into school or we don't. We juggle them however we do. And kids, the same thing. They might be in school, but things are happening to them. Experiences, maybe they're traveling, maybe events, maybe learnings, maybe friendships, and all these things, part of what I would call the life cycle, are so much part of all the students that we have, and they live day to day with that, and teachers too. You might have a really rough day, but when you come into the classroom, you're smiling and you're ready for the kids. And one of the things about educators is you're so resilient. And I think schools are just such a rich place because they're safe. Kids like to come there because they know they're cared for, they have all their friends, and they have many adults whose priority is to make sure that they're safe, that they're comfortable, and that they're learning. And that is really a rich and invigorating place for a child to be. And also, as adults, we love being in that environment as educators, curating and facilitating these experiences for our students. Now, one of the things that often happens when kids are in schools, reality sometimes knocks at their door. That reality might be they have to leave and their parents are moving. Maybe they have to change schools. Maybe somebody is sick in their family. Maybe they have a little accident, whatever. And those realities all have an impact on the emotion and the well being of everybody involved, be it teachers, students, and friends. Death is something that very likely we tend not to talk about. And the fact is, all of us have that experience. Somebody passes in our family, a close friend, a partner, a spouse, and same with children. They have grandparents passing away, maybe their neighbor, maybe somebody they knew, maybe their parent, maybe a relative. And when that happens, comes a whole flurry of emotions, be it sad, and different stages, the way we grieve and the way we manage that, be it as an adult, an educator, or even a child. A 3-year-old will deal with it maybe very differently than a 16-year-old. But the fact is, whatever this event is, and whatever that death has happened and where, this comes into school because it does impact not only the student, but it can impact their peers, it can impact the community, the parents, the larger community, but it can also impact the teachers. And generally, I think sometimes we're a little cautious, we're a little reticent, and we're a little, how would I say, scared maybe to really dive into that topic and have those discussions. How do you frame that when you know a child in your classroom or your colleague has lost somebody and death is kind of in the forefront of their mind? How do you juggle that? How do you manage that as a school, as an educator, as a school community? Well, last year I had the real pleasure of presenting at a conference in southern France. And one of the co presenters that I got to know, and we had many conversations, and then I got to go to her workshop, is really a specialist in this area of bereavement in schools. And Alka Townend is the Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Lead, Assistant Professor in Education and Social Work at the University of Sussex. And Alka has done a lot of work in this area, works with a lot of organizations across the United Kingdom, and also does teach and support schools and counselors, and is doing a lot of research in this space. And after attending her workshop, where she really talked to us about different strategies through the use of literature, and it was so powerful the way she had books, and then we unpacked some of these feelings and some of the challenges that you engage with, I thought, you have to come on the International Schools podcast. She was very hesitant, but she's being super brave and she's here. And I feel such a privilege and such an honor, Alka, to have you here today for this podcast. So, first of all, a warm welcome.
Thank you, John, and thank you for that introduction. That was very thorough, and I think I perhaps should add to that my remit for the last 12 years has been to train teachers. So that's what I do at the University of Sussex on the BA programmes and the PGCE. So I've been involved in teacher training now for the last, about 13 years. And prior to that, I was a teacher in school.
Great. So, Alka, we talked a lot about this offline when we were at the conference, and
Yeah.
I'm wondering, as I described in the intro, why are we hesitant to engage with the issue of death and bereavement in schools? I'm
Mm.
not saying schools don't deal with it, they
No.
do, but often it's very stressful. A lot of people aren't sure. Often we bring in outside resources, counselors, psychologists. It depends on the context. And many different international schools, being international, sometimes some of those resources aren't available. There might be language barriers, there might be cultural things to be sensitive because everybody bereaves differently. Tell me from your experience, because you've done a lot of research and you work with schools, what are some of the things that you think we should understand about bereavement in schools?
Okay, so if I can pick up on a few points, John. First of all, you opened this by talking about how school and home is so interlinked, isn't it, with what happens at home? So, and I'm thinking there of Brofenbrenner's ecological model, where he shows the concentric circles, and school and home are in the same circle. So, what happens at home impacts children in school also. Yeah, but where the topic of death is concerned, there are often cultural issues associated with discussing death with children. Yeah, there's people have some communities have a belief that children should be protected from talking about death, that it's a taboo to discuss death with children, and that it won't happen in their community. And if it does happen in the school community, that they can react to it as and when it happens. And what I always advocate for is having a proactive approach to death, loss, and grief rather than reactive, because as you've just pointed out, there isn't always the funding to get that support when a child needs it. And also, if you normalize conversations around death and loss, it provides a very supportive and environment for children where they can actually support their peers and have those open conversations. All the time it remains as a taboo, it can become very difficult for children who return to school after a death, and they often become isolated. Research has shown that.
Now, tell us, people often, and we were talking before we started recording, you said, oh, this is never going to happen to me. It's very rare. It happens in the home, but it's not going to happen here. Tell us a bit about some of the realities of that and how that might be wrong.
Yeah, I think it's really important to share some facts with you and the people that listen to your podcast, and it will be situated in the UK. But I can just tell you that every 22 minutes in the UK, a parent of a child under 18 dies. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah.
And this is in the United Kingdom, so we can imagine in other places the numbers are similar.
Yes. Yeah. And in fact, there's been a petition just last week for the government to record the number of bereaved children in the UK, because without this categorical data, it's very hard to move forward with this. And when you think children, you talked about different forms of bereavement and loss, but grandparents, relatives, pets often is, that's childhood experience. And I think there's a misnomer around this, what I call hierarchical experience of death. Oh, it was a grandparent, it was expected to happen. Oh, it was only a pet. These are kind of misnomers that we can all, I think, be guilty of. But I'd like to dispel some of those myths. And what we also know is that although death is not on the curriculum and loss is not on the curriculum, that a lot of topics, sensitive topics, often get overlooked in schools, which means it's a lottery for children. It might depend on the head teacher, whether they have a great passion for a particular, because they've had an experience themselves. It might depend on a class teacher. And currently, based on my research that I did as well, that is how it stands. It may be that dependent on that. And what we do know, and I think it's very important, is that unresolved grief can have a significant and lasting impact on a child's well-being. And it's been associated with depression, anxiety, and other psychological issues, as well as lowering academic outcomes as well. And in, more extreme cases, but substance misuse, unemployment, and criminal convictions and suicide. So the research has shown us that. And that is why I believe that it's really essential that we equip schools and teachers with some understanding around how grief might manifest and how the role that they play in being able to support children. And I think we should also dispel another myth. It's not counselling. It's not counselling. If a child...
Tell me, because that's a very interesting point you bring up. It's not counseling.
No.
Why not? Because often in my own experience, when I've been in schools when unfortunately there has been a death, obviously the school psychologist and the counselor are immediately kind of pushed in the forefront because we assume with good intent that they're the best equipped to deal with bereavement.
I think in a way it's good if you have those resources, and if there is, I think what we have to remember as well is every experience of death is unique to the individual, and that is very dependent on their background, their beliefs, the type of death, their relationship with the deceased. So based on that, it may be that counsellor would be better placed to talk to the class teacher and find out what the teacher's observed in that bereaved child, what sort of behaviours, how it's manifesting, and then a weighted decision can be made around whether the child needs to see the counsellor or whether the teacher will have some can be equipped with some strategies to support that child.
It's interesting because I think so often, as you're talking about the myths and the different types of bereavement, and everyone is different and unique, I think sometimes we can, especially with pets and kids, brush that over, and even adults. I'm just thinking of my own recent experience where somebody lost their pet, and I was somewhat surprised as how dramatic their emotions were. And actually catching myself, I thought, wow, hold on here. There's a whole backstory that maybe I don't know.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about the different types of bereavement and why not to brush it over. What are some things that when you're with schools and you work with head teachers, you work with many schools around the UK, what are some strategies that you're saying, hold on here, head teacher, these are the things that you should think about?
Okay, so because I'm sure your listeners want some, like, what can we do? What can we do? What would be, Okay, so I think, first of all, it's really important let's start with the basics, to consider a bereavement policy. Because just by having a policy in school, what you're saying is we understand and recognise and acknowledge that this can be a childhood experience, okay? And training for the staff in some form. Because what I found in my research study, which I undertook with 6 participants, all senior leaders in schools, was that there were different reasons that they didn't engage in bereavement training. And also they didn't know where to start. So you need a starting point. So having a bereavement policy, taking advice on what to put in that policy, is something that's really important. And what would that be? So you would have, how do we respond to a bereavement when it happens? But also prior to that, and what is really important in the terms of proactive approaches, it's how we will talk about death and loss in our curriculum. Yeah. So that
So you're
might be,
actually preempting that by having
yes,
it,
yes, because
yeah,
studies have shown that children who have the opportunity to engage in grief education programs are more able to discuss their loss and feel less anxious about death.
interesting, interesting.
Okay, so what does that look like in the curriculum? So if you think about history, if you think about literacy, so in history, some of my participants told me we skip over how many people died in the war. We might give a statistic and then we move on from it. They talk about life cycles. They skip over the death part, yeah, when they teach the life
Interesting.
cycles. In literacy, they will maybe avoid those books that have covered the topics or concept of death, loss, grieving, because they're fearful that it'll upset the children. Yeah. And my argument is if you embed this from very early on, okay, it normalizes those that, and then when the worst, or you may say inevitable, happens, yes, children are not afraid to ask those questions. And if you think about it, how much better supported a child might be when they return to school to an empathetic environment and a compassionate environment where their friends are able to support them. And I think, John, I don't remember if I told you this, my whole interest in this stemmed from a friend's experience of her husband dying. And when her children went back to school, they fully expected to be received by their friends with a greater fuss than normal and received by the teachers. And in fact, they were absolutely stunned, shocked to find out that they were isolated from their friends because their friends didn't know what to say. The communication between teachers, especially in secondary school, some subject teachers knew, other subject teachers didn't know what had happened. So again, in the policy, it's a school showing a commitment that if a child has had a bereavement, that information will follow them through. And who are we to judge whether a child's experienced a bereavement in reception, whether we shouldn't know about that when they're 16? Because often children will feel that loss far more acutely in subsequent years.
And what I'm hearing is then, because you're talking about this proactiveness, having the bereavement policy, making sure everybody's clear, good communication channels, understanding if a child lost their parent at pre-reception and now they're in year 6, there still might be some things that are connected to that that are important for the teacher to know. And so what is happening then, I assume, and you tell me if I'm wrong, many schools are just kind of winging it as best as they can with whoever they can. But I'm making a
Let's not cast
generalization.
aspersions,
Yeah,
John,
no,
on
no,
them,
no. I
but
know, I know, I know, I know, I know.
but I think it comes from a, you know, schools care about their children and their pupils. They understand, look how much more money has been poured into well-being, etc. Yeah. But I think there are assumptions and myths which are things like grief follows. Let's give you an example, a linear process. That's not true. Yeah. You've got something like, so if your listeners want to look up something like Warden's tasks of mourning. Yeah. And Warden describes 4 tasks of mourning as task 1, to accept the reality of the loss. Task 2, to process the pain of grief. Task 3, to adjust to a world without the deceased. And task 4, to find an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. Think of all those grown-up things I've just said to you and imagine that from a child's perspective.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's really interesting you bringing that up, because even as an adult, depending on the person and the relationship and the dynamics and so many different variables, it is very challenging to deal with grief. And then
Mm-hmm.
as you say, I'm a 4-year-old or I'm a 5-year-old or even a teenager. That's super interesting. And so what are you noticing when you start working with kids on this? How receptive are kids? You, of course, work with teachers too, right? I mean, I'm saying grief is for everybody. Are you focused more on the child or on
No,
the
I'm
teacher?
focused more on the training for the schools and the for teachers and for my trainee teachers. So if I can just talk a little bit about that, John, because,
Yeah.
I've always thought that teacher training and working in a university it's such an important job, isn't it? We're setting out these people, these teachers of the future, the educators of the future. And one of the participants who took part in my research told me that the reason she had a passion for bereavement, and this is 20-something years later after she qualified, was when she started in her first job as a newly qualified teacher, she was faced with twins who had lost both their parents in a car crash in the summer. Now, if you think about a young 21-year-old teacher with absolutely no knowledge or experience or training, and to manage, and bear in mind, we're going back a long time, and that's what made her feel passionate about this. And my worry is that, why do we wait for it to happen? That is where the line of proactive comes into play. Now, if you were asking me how will the children react to well, you probably yourself, children can be very accepting from a young age, and they ask very direct questions. And I can say to you from the beginning that 2 to 5 year olds have a very, they're quite literal. And that's why when you have to be very clear with them about death and say that person has died. And I'd say a lot around the language of death, because we all tend to sugarcoat it and say they've gone to sleep, they've gone to be with the stars. That's actually very confusing for a child. And
Can I come back to that point that you just brought up, is that the language. So you're talking about, when you're dealing with kids, and even as adults, we always, with death, we're always very cautious what words to write. Or when you're writing a card, a bereavement card, it's always, how do you write that? What's the right thing to say? Tell us a bit about the language, because I think sometimes people do have a bit of a sugar coating. And I think that's just out of this, it's out of a need to kind of protect themselves and also not to offend anybody. But you're saying the language is important. What should we be doing that maybe we're not?
Well, I think, John, it's going to be a hard listen, this bit, but we need to be very clear with children about what death means. And when someone is dead, they stop breathing, they no longer feel hunger, they no longer feel thirst, and they no longer feel pain. Yeah. And we will not see them again. But this leads me into one of the models of grief that I talk about a lot, which is continuing bonds. And I think allowing a child to continue to talk about the deceased and their memories of the deceased, very, very important. And it's, I told you that I'm a trained bereavement volunteer for a national charity called Cruise, and I support bereaved children in schools. And one of the key strategies I use is giving those children permission to talk about the person who has died, because sometimes they're afraid to do this at home, because if it's a grandparent and it's their mum's mum, they're worried about upsetting their mum, so they don't talk about them. And also do remember, if it's a parent they've lost, how hard is that for the child? They're in their home environment, which is nothing like it used to be. Okay, there's there's so much disruption. They might have different carers. There's grief. They don't necessarily see that as a space where they can express their emotions. And the next place, going back to Brofenbrenner, is school and is their class teacher. Okay, but let's think about the class teacher in this and think, what a weight of responsibility if you haven't had that training or support or knowledge of how grief might manifest. Do you remember, John, I talked to you about puddle jumping and how...
Yeah, tell us about that. That was great.
Yeah, because and I completely understand why, but you might think, oh, that child's been grieving, and you can see the change, and then suddenly they seem to pick up, and you think, oh, a lot of people will think that child's getting over that grief. Yeah, they're getting over it, they're coming to terms with it, they're moving on. And then a month later, you suddenly get the child's, academically regressed again. It manifests in young children sometimes They regress to sort of what one might term babyish behaviours, sucking their thumb. They might not get to the toilet in time and things like that. You think, but I thought they were okay. But in fact, do you know, grieving is exhausting. Yeah. And sometimes we as adults too, yeah, we need a break from it. So why we call it puddle jumping is children often will jump in and out of puddles of grief, and there sometimes can be a trigger. It may be the anniversary of the death. It may be an item that they've seen around the house that really made them, a photograph. That's really, so puddle jumping is something that children do, but also as adults we do as well. And as I said, you know, grieving is exhausting for children, and sometimes school can provide a safe haven for them. And what we need is educators who understand all these things. And I think teachers, where one of my participants said, but as teachers, we have to be everything to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's a big ask.
It is a big ask. It's a huge ask. Now, you've been talking about younger kids, and now we know with teenagers
Yeah.
sometimes, and you know, within certain countries, the teenagers can already drive. There might be alcohol and drugs, and you know, teenagers might have a sense of fear much lower, and sometimes there are these unfortunate deaths. Are you interacting with teenagers in a very different dynamic? So I assume for every kind of age band, there is a different approach to bereavement, and then of course adults.
Yes, and you've got to understand that at different ages, children understand grief in different ways. And bearing in mind, you know, children of primary age up to 7 or 8, they might experience a loss and start a bit of this magical thinking where it was my fault, or if only I could change that, it might not have happened if this has happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then with older children, and especially teenagers, they're trying to assert their independence. We all know that teenagers as well often think, but I'm grown up, I can manage this. So they're trying to assert their independence. And so they might not reach out for help. But the grief will manifest in certain behaviours and things like, particularly with teenagers, you've mentioned perhaps behaviours that are very different to the ones you knew of the child before. So they might start not doing homework. They might start hanging out with a different crowd. They might start coming to school late or missing school or risky behaviours. Okay. And teachers need to be aware of that's on their radar, and therefore being equipped to have those conversations with that child.
And
the parent and the remaining parent or the carer. I think the thing is, John, when I talk about, I'd love to do a separate thing on the policy and advise on the policy, but really communication with the family is key. Communication with the family is key, because and it might not be if it's a parent who's died and the remaining parent, they might not be up to it, but another family member who can come into school, who can meet with you and say, this is what we've told the child. This is our culture. These are our beliefs. Yes, because you need to be aware. A lot of people ask me, but what if the family said, oh, that person's gone to be in heaven or gone to be with God? And a way around that is to say a lot of people believe many different things. And then you talk about, you know, Christians believe this, Hindus believe this and whatever, but we don't know for sure. Okay. But you asked me, I think you wanted to know about how we can manage this in an international context. And one thing I would say is developing staff understanding around different cultures and religions and beliefs. And I'm not saying you need to know it inside out, but it might be worth a conversation with your RE coordinator. But I imagine when you work in international context, like you will do, the thing is, you will find out about that anyway. You find out about that. And to be honest, in England we do, because our classrooms are so multicultural.
Yeah. Now, what about in a school? Of course, teachers pass away, which is always very tragic, or they have an experience of bereavement, somebody in their family and circle. How is that different for kids when they maybe have a teacher that falls ill and passes away, or a teacher has experience of bereavement and then is trying to manage your day-to-day work with their colleagues? What does that
Yeah.
look like? What are some
Okay.
things to be mindful
So
of?
that was multi-pronged, that question. I'll try
I
and
know
address
I'm
it.
terrible with that. I have a bad
No.
reputation.
So
Sorry.
in terms of the teacher, if the teacher has an unresolved bereavement issue themselves, I think this is where the training comes in. But for teachers, because what I would say is, as a class teacher, and certainly I can speak from experience, you have a class with children who have all come to you from different backgrounds, different experiences. It may be abuse, it may be migration, it may be all different things they've experienced. And as teachers, we are expected to deal with that in some way. I would say the same goes for bereavement. Yeah. But making sure you're equipped and ready at a time when the conversation is right for you. And also not apologizing if the teacher feels slightly emotional, is saying, I feel a bit emotional too. Perhaps we both need to have some time out. But if the bereavement is so close to a teacher and it's so recent, it may be another nominated person needs to be able to support the child.
Yeah.
But I think also, John, if you're talking about just doing this in a reactive way, this is where it becomes sticky, because it's not natural to be having those conversations. Whereas if you've embedded proactively the topics of death and loss into the curriculum, you're reading those books, some of which I shared with you through the bibliotherapy, where we've had those conversations, then it becomes easier and more normal to be able to engage in that type of conversation.
It's so important what you're saying about the preactiveness. And it's interesting, you started the podcast about having a bereavement policy and maybe also some communication. And
Yes.
as we're talking and really exploring this topic, it just really highlights that really be ready for the unexpected in many ways.
Yeah, I think it's almost like crisis management, what we will do. Think about how companies do that. Businesses and companies do that. And another thing that came up in my research, and hear me out on this because it may sound strange, was that if parents are going to really object to their children learning about death, even though we know it's a sure thing, if one thing's going to happen, it's a sure thing, okay, we're going to experience. It's approaching this in the curriculum and in your bereavement policy in the same way you do sex education. So what's the correlation? The correlation is you send out a letter and you say, we're going to be covering this. We'd like to invite you in for an evening. And parents come in, they look at the literature you're going to use, they learn about the language you're going to use, they have conversations about their fears, and then you assuage, hopefully, but you're also saying to them, this is our stance as a school. This is in our bereavement policy, which is published, and we believe that by normalizing this, it will engender a more compassionate and empathetic classroom for any child who experiences any form of loss as well.
It's great the way you connect it to sex education, because that's a whole other podcast.
I
But
know.
that's always, fraught and
Yeah,
especially in multicultural contexts, what's appropriate,
absolutely.
what you can't say. So it's a really nice analogy, the way you connected that. What about when a teacher passes away and their children in the sense their students experience that, or in the building? What are the dynamics for that? What are some guidelines or even some reflections you think people
Mm.
should consider?
I mean, actually, I can theoretically say, but I can also say from experience, from when one of my children experienced the loss of a teacher outside the front of their school. And it was handled really well. The children who were there were taken to a safe place. There was a letter that came out to parents immediately, within 2 hours, about what had happened. And why were they able to do this? Because they had some plans in place beforehand, should anything like this happen. And then the children were offered, if they wanted to see someone like a priest or a vicar, or they just wanted someone who they could talk to, a counsellor, or just a reflective space. All that was made available for them. And if you think about it, John, it removes this mystery and to be around by saying, we will all be affected by this as a community, and we are all going to open up this dialogue and talk to each other about it. Yeah. Rather than the teachers, I'm not suggesting any schools will do this, but the teacher disappears, asks parents to talk about it with their child at home, and that's it. I think there's unanswered questions for children there, particularly for those in secondary school, often you know your teachers really well, and you may be studying their subjects at GCSE or A level or whatever. I think having those strategies in place and people you can call upon should all be included in the policy. And in fact, just to add to the policy, the other reason I advocate for policy is having template letters, because it could be different people in the school who are responding. What we need is consistency. So as a school, we would like to express our condolences. We want to let you know that this is the system. Would you, and these are the questions maybe you can consider, we'd like to consider in the meeting. How would you like us to let the rest of the community know? Would you like your child's peer group to know? There's some template letters, but also going forward, John, when I was saying, dear Mrs. whoever, we're aware the anniversary of your husband's partner's death is coming up, and we just wondered if you'd like us to acknowledge this in any way. So we need quite a tight admin system here to make sure that support is in place, and transfer documents between teachers and between schools.
But that's quite powerful if you can be that proactive, because the recipient suddenly feels the community, and they're also sensitive. Like, our policy is, how would you like us to communicate? Not that we're going to communicate this way. No. And I think that's really interesting. And also the idea of an anniversary for a child and being mindful. These kind of things really kind of amplify why schools are such amazing places, is when we take the time, as you said, a very tight admin. So you really have to have your systems in and your structures so you can really amplify that kind of response. And that really has an immense positive impact. One of the things, Alka, you did and have done is you've used books. And you talked a lot in your workshop, you had many different kind of books. A lot of them were picture books, but if I remember correctly, some were for adolescent books. Yeah. Talk to me how literature can be helpful, not only when the bereavement occurs, but as you're saying, as you're being proactive, if you have those kind of stories to frame this conversation.
I think, John, I gave you a list which I'm sure you can share with everyone of the sorts of books. That was just a recommendations for books. So if anyone wants to know about those, but if we take a couple of the books I shared with you, because at least you can contribute then. It really struck me something you said with a book I shared with you by Michael Rosen called The Sad Book.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yes. Now, that book, everyone in the workshop asked me, what age group would you? And I said, well, I would possibly start it around year 4 or 5. And I remember you saying to me, I would use this with sixth formers. Yes, that book, Michael Rosen's Sad Book.
Exactly,
and the other thing you said was that really struck you was that the book was written from an adult perspective of grief.
Yeah. Yeah, which was really, I thought that was interesting.
It's so powerful, that book, and I agree with you 100%. I would use it in with children.
Name the title, Michael Rosen, and the title
Michael
again?
Rosen's Sad Book.
The Sad Book. So just if you haven't had a chance, Michael Rosen's Sad Book.
We'll give you a list of recommended books. So in terms of young children, if you're aware of the literary device known as anthropomorphism, it's where characters, animals are given human kinds of characteristics and qualities to it. And it's a slightly safer way for children to experience literature. I think, I don't know if we added in, by the way, that I lecture in English. So this is why I've kind of moved bereavement into my English arena as well, and seen it as a good excuse to buy lots of more picture books to add to my increasing collection. So anthropomorphism is one, and it's often a safe space way for children to have that dialogue about. And if you remember, we looked at a book called The Memory Tree as
Yes.
well, and what I loved about that book is it exemplified the notion of continuing bonds, which is Silverman and Class a theory, which is how it really, if you're going to boil it right down, is how you can continue a relationship with the deceased, albeit in a very different way. And how is that? It's okay to remember them. It's okay to laugh when you think about those memories. It's okay to talk to them. And in that book, if you remember, John, the animals all gathered under the tree and hung all their favourite items from the tree that reminded them and encouraged them to talk and remember that person. So continuing bonds is something I really advocate. And it's difficult because teachers have told me, in research I've done, other research more recently, about is there anything that you think might prevent you from discussing loss with children? There's a fear of saying the wrong thing, so they abstain totally. Whereas opening up that conversation and giving the child permission to talk about their beloved grandma who used to sneak them sweets and who used to do all those things, that is a way of healing. Yeah.
So that continuing bond is this way of healing. But as you're describing this, say, we're worried about saying the wrong thing. Is it better to say the wrong thing than nothing, or then apologize? I'm just curious because, so often when in multicultural environments and in different socioeconomic environments, everybody has different perspectives. And we are nowadays in a world where what you say can be very impactful and also backfire on you. So there is this hesitation sometimes. Talk to me a bit about, you're almost saying it's say something, be open more than being silent. But if you're being silent because you don't know what to say, what is your advice?
I think, because you said, is it better to say nothing? I think it's not. I don't think, obviously, this is what I do. I think not acknowledging what that child's going through can be really challenging. But depending on the circumstances of the death, depending on the culture, depending on the parental wishes, the least you can do as a class teacher, and we know this from research in Denmark and other European countries, the children said just their class teacher's hand on their shoulder to say, I'm here for you. Let me know if you want to talk to me about anything. That was enough.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Yeah, and that's a great image, is just seeing the teacher. Absolutely. That's just so important. So, you talked about the myth and mysteries. Are those myth and mysteries because this topic in society? I mean, if you think of it, we're flooded on our social media feeds with horrible footage of all these different places. And even within our own context and in our own cultures and our own environments, why has it become such a mystery? And do you think schools are getting better? Do you think as you do this work and you work with schools and the research you're doing, do you think we're getting better at this? Are we coming to terms with it?
I definitely, and I've seen, since I did my original research, which I believe it or not, was in 2020 during COVID. Now, any of your listeners who are researchers out there know that you often have to chase participants to take part in your research. What I found was participants were coming to me saying, I really want to take part in this research, because they were all senior leaders in schools. They were fearful of what their children, the pupils in their school, might have seen and experienced during the pandemic. And then what they were going to be coming back into school having seen. And if you think about the news and the things that, we saw death rates, we saw bodies piled up, there was a lot. And that's when so I think there has been a change since the pandemic. I also have noticed, obviously, because of this petition that I've told you about, so we've got quite a lot of work going on now about this campaigning for grief and loss to be included in the curriculum in the UK. And I would say to you, in the international context where you're maybe not constricted by the national curriculum, okay, that your teachers may have more autonomy to be addressing this. And whether it be, even I'm thinking of in year reception or year one, you know, starting with a book, starting with a book, thinking about, I know in year two, they often do life cycles, they, you know, making those small changes and creating the bereavement policy can make such a difference. And I think training your staff, don't just tell the staff, this is another thing for you to do and add in. It's saying, we're going to have an hour and a half's training just on bereavement, so we've all got some knowledge. We're not asking you to be counsellors, but these are some of the things we need to look out for. Here are some of the strategies. We've got someone we can ask who to help us with this bereavement policy. I think that would be a fantastic starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as professional development and equipping educators with some strategies and awarenesses. And as you said, we're not asking them to be counselors, but we're saying we just want you to have this toolkit and an awareness. So when you're confronted with it, do you find that if you had to identify an age group in schools K-12, are teenagers harder, or like do you find, or is it everyone is so unique and different, there's really not one harder than the other?
I would say everyone is so unique and different. And sometimes, you know, when I've gone to support a child, I think I must make you aware that there's it's called complicated grief or prolonged grief, and teachers need to be very aware of that, because that's when external help should be. And prolonged grief, and it's when an individual is losing their ability to engage in any kind of normal activities, and that the grief is so intense and persistent. And that's when outside interventions are necessary. I feel I've deviated from that original question. Remind me of the original question.
It was more about the different age groups. You know, are teenagers
the different age groups? It very much is dependent on. And there's another thing that is really important. And I know you sort of picked up on how important you thought this one aspect of this was. There's people are unaware of a thing called disenfranchised grief. And disenfranchised grief is where the death of the person is not acknowledged. So I'll give you an example. If you had a child who was estranged from a parent because of divorce, incarceration, or whatever, they haven't seen that parent for 5-10 years, and that parent dies, there is an assumption that it won't be as bad. Their grieving process won't be as bad, because that's actually that's disenfranchised grief. And again, we can all be guilty of it and making those assumptions, but in fact, that can have a huge impact on a child. So, and particularly, I'm going to say, imagine it's a teenager who hasn't had that contact from a young age, and then but also because teenagers understand the finality of death as well, they may experience it differently. But I think it's really important to emphasize it depends on the nature of the death as well, and particularly, and this is a whole other subject, when you get into death by suicide.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing. Absolutely. Now, when you are working with your teachers, and so you're going out there, you're working, and you're also involved with charities, what is it like for a school that doesn't address this? What have you seen that what are some of the immediate challenges that you see? Because you've really laid out, first of all, have a policy, be proactive. How can you, weave it into the curriculum? How we talk about this before we need to really worry about it, and that we have this open communication. We have a good infrastructure with admin that, reaches out. We're very open. We have also resources if possible, but also teachers are trained. So you've kind of got this package. What have you seen when schools absolutely have nothing?
They have told me directly that it felt like panic stations, and that they didn't feel, and they thought, okay, so this has happened, we need to ring a charity and get someone in for this child. And of course, the charities are deluged with requests, and sometimes they can't get in the immediate. But actually, also having spoken, and you don't often get this, but I'm going to be involved in some research around this, but I've had the voice of a child, and this is not official research, this is from an experience of a friend of mine. And the child said to me, after 6 months, I had a counsellor in. We sat in an empty room, just it was nothing. It was just a spare small class, not even a classroom, just virtually a cupboard. And there was nothing on the walls. And all I wanted to do was get out of there, because actually I'd have far preferred to talk to my class teacher.
Wow. Very powerful. And
Yeah.
that's such a great note. So, Alka, thank you. And before we go, what we always ask is if you had one piece of advice, or not even advice, something you would want to invite people to consider, a teacher and a school leader, what would it be as we wrap up this topic?
Okay. So for a school leader, I'd really ask them to consider having an SLT meeting to discuss maybe something they've heard on this podcast and saying, what can we do? What should we do? And one of the first things they could do is think about having a bereavement policy, which they can seek advice on. There's things online, I'm available as a consultant as well on this. I've done it before, but also, how do we all feel about having some training? And then emphasizing to their teachers, we're not asking you to be counsellors. Yeah, we're actually looking after your well-being as well, because it's very upsetting and stressful for teachers if there's a death in the community of a child's parent. It's upsetting for them as well. And so it's actually looking after everyone's well-being within that.
Excellent. And for teachers, what would you invite them to consider?
I'd invite them to consider engaging in the training. I'd even, from listening to this podcast, if they do a little bit of research themselves and equip themselves with some base knowledge of how important their role is in a child's grief journey. And just that hand on the arm we talked about, John, and thinking of a named adult who they can work with, who can support that child, that would be a start.
Absolutely. And I still love the way you described the hand on the child's shoulder. I want to remind our audience, as always, Alka has put a lot of work into the resources. It's amazing. So you will have the resources below the podcast, and you can connect with her on LinkedIn if you're interested in finding out more. And you can see reports and also the research that she's done. And she has a wonderful list of books, and then she also has some UK charities, and Alka's based in the UK, but you make it quite clear on the show notes that many countries have infrastructures, and in different countries around the world.
They do. They do. Yeah. But do remember, you can access the resource materials from the UK. But also, I put American ones as well. I put some others on there for you, didn't I? I gave you quite a comprehensive list from a few different countries.
Absolutely. And that's really appreciated. Yeah. So, Alka, thank you so much. And it's just been such a pleasure. And I know it's not the most, comfortable and sometimes a little difficult, but I really appreciated when we met, and also through your workshop, how you not normalized it, but it just felt like, okay, we can talk about this in a safe space. And I think that's what I walked away from your workshop and the work that you're doing. Let's be open, let's support each other. And there's no better people than to support each other than a school community and all these educators that are part of our larger community. That this is what brings children, and that's why they smile, because they get to go into these wonderful buildings with these people that care. So thank you very much, Alka, for all your time.
Thank you.
And for our audience, we look forward to seeing you at our next podcast. And thank you again. People keep sending ideas, and you are supporting us with your comments and likes on LinkedIn and other social media points. We really appreciate your continued support, and look forward to talking very soon. Thank you.